Welcome back to Diversity Show. It's always a pleasure to have you as our viewers. All right, my name is Glory Ezemma. So once again, I will host this show. It's a show where we bridge the gap between races, where people come out, talk about their racial backgrounds, and then clear some of the stereotypes so that we can all live in peace and harmony. Because I strongly believe that we can live in peace and harmony. The only problem that we have is that we don't know each other. So once again, we keep on basing things on stereotype. And we've had so many things that are going on in the news. We had about the racial and ethnic tensions. But this show, I hope, I'm very optimistic about it, that it will bridge the gap between the races and we can all understand each other and love each other. So, on my show today, I have a man that I will call United Nation. I know people will be wondering, why am I calling him a United Nation? Because he's half black, half white. So he represents the black race. He also represents the white race. So his name is Bill Batson. Mr. Batson lives in Nyack, New York, and he's a great man. So I'm not going to say so much about him because he's at the show. So I will allow him to introduce himself and tell you who he is and what he does. All right, so please help me welcome my guest today, Mr. Bill Batson. Welcome to the show, the Diversity Show.
Thank you.
It's a pleasure to have you here.
It's an honor to be here.
Yes. Thank you so much for honoring my invitation. I know you're a very busy man.
Well, we're all busy.
Yes. So for you to take time to come to this show, I truly appreciate it. All right. So tell us a little bit about yourself, because I've heard so much about you and what you do across the nations.
Well, I'm humbled and flattered to be referred to as the United Nations. I think there are some people probably more worthy of that title that have a more eclectic mix. Sometimes in America, actually, we get stuck in black and white.
That's true.
And as you said, there's such a stereotype with each, because when you say black, are you Southern black? Are you West Indian black? Are you from one of the countries of Africa? So, and then white is also as diverse. Even the word white and black are just sometimes problematic. But I am half black and I am half white. I do identify with that, so that's accurate. And my family's been in Nyack, as I described earlier, for a long time, since the 1880s. In African and in American culture, it's sometimes unique, I find, that a black family would have such longevity, because there's always kind of dislocation and displacement. Black neighborhoods rise and fall. There's that thing called gentrification.
That's true.
When a neighborhood is neglected until it's called a slum, and then when it's a slum, it's bulldozed for the benefit of someone else, and the people who live there are shuffled somewhere else. So, but my family has somehow managed to keep a toehold here in Nyack since the 1880s. When we met, and as I described earlier, I was adopted into this family. So it's an African American family, although within any family of even, I think, most races, there's always different complexions. So there were darker members of my family, lighter members of my family. But in this country, when they were doing adoptions around the time I was adopted in the early 60s, they kind of tried to color code you. Okay. So if you were a dark-skinned family, they would discourage you from bringing home a light-skinned child.
Oh, so they match you based on the
color
of your skin.
They do a little bit of that, because my family was able to, for whatever reasons at the time, they didn't share with me the adoption for a while. So it was clearly evident. It was not evident to anyone who saw us that I wasn't from the family. But my birth father is Kenyan, and I wore my Kenyan shirt.
Wow. So you're from Africa too?
I'm from Africa.
Because actually in Africa, what we do is like the lineage is more like paternal. So that means wherever your father is from, that's exactly where you're
go.
from. That's
There
how
we
it is in
go.
America. No, in Africa. But I've realized that here in America, it's more like maternal. So wherever your mother is from.
It's different cultures, because I know in Jewish culture, if you're not Jewish unless your mother's Jewish, so it changes. But I've spent time in Kenya, and I could tell you about that.
So I will adopt you as a Kenyan.
Well, thank you.
I'm from Africa too.
I appreciate that.
Okay.
There we go.
Thank you.
East meets West.
Yes, I'm from
Very
Nigeria.
good. West Africa.
Yes.
So, and my mother is European, American, a white woman of German and British extraction. So it's interesting. My whole life I've been fascinated with African culture, British culture, and German culture. And I didn't know until I was, far along that was my ancestry.
Wow. What a wonderful story. What a wonderful story. All right. So we talked about Kenya. And then have you been to Kenya?
Yes. Yeah, I've been there 2 times. I've been there twice.
Okay. How long did you stay when you traveled to Kenya?
The first time, they were both relatively short trips, about 14 days each trip.
All right. So did you have any culture shock? Like, you were born here, raised here, then all of a sudden you went to Kenya. So what was the culture shocks that you experienced when you went to Kenya?
It was unfamiliar, but I had a half step. So
Okay.
the first time I arrived in Nairobi, it was after living in South Africa for about a year. And South Africa is oddly familiar for Americans. It's an English-speaking country primarily. I mean, they have 11 official languages, but English is a predominant language. You can basically speak to anyone in the languages. So when you see signs, they're written in English. So it was highly developed where I was in Cape Town in Johannesburg, or Gauteng as it's called now. It's an advanced urban metropolis environment. So I was on kind of familiar footing. Kenya was very different. Kenya I felt like the first hop was going back in time to like maybe Newark, New Jersey in the 60s. For some reason, the buildings looked kind of like the architecture you see in Newark, New Jersey. But then as you travel outside of Nairobi, I felt like every 100 miles was like going back 100 years in time.
Wow.
And then when I got to some of the rural areas, I really felt, as if it was the early kind of early world of the beginning of civilizations, which is actually what you find in Olduvai Gorge and parts of Kenya. But even there, it felt oddly familiar.
All right. So just to get it right, so to understood exactly between Kenya and South Africa. So South Africa is more developed than Kenya, is it?
To some extent. I mean, it is. I think that for many years, South Africa. Well, it's kind of the accident of place. I think the struggle in South Africa was so intense because of the natural resources that were discovered under the ground.
Exactly.
And certain parts you have diamonds and you have gold and you have uranium. So
it's a very rich country.
It's a very rich country, and all actually African countries have their wealth, but that was particularly of value to the West, and I think also of strategic importance because it was at the Cape of Good Hope. Okay. So from a navigating point of view, it became sought after, and as I mentioned earlier, gentrification, you can think of colonialism as a form of gentrification. People discover a place where other people are, and they find a way to push them out. They didn't really necessarily push Africans out. They kind of pushed them down through subjugation. So you had forced labor and a kind of, domestic slavery of Africans in the country. So South Africa has, that kind of dynamic. But Kenya is, certainly development isn't necessarily always a good thing. I mean, what you have with development is you can have overdevelopment, you can have pollution. So I wasn't necessarily trying to suggest that it's a better place, but it's different. And for a person growing up in the United States, South Africa just felt a little bit more familiar.
Oh, okay. All right. So when you went to Kenya, did you go as a tourist or you went to visit family members?
Well, I went to look for my family.
Oh, okay. Did you find them?
Not the first time.
All right. So the second time, and when you went, you found them.
Yes, I did.
Okay. All right. So compared to United States, I know this is a very developed country. So which place would you like to live? Like, do you like to live in a natural area of Kenya, or would you prefer to live in America? I mean, based on your experience from traveling around.
Well, I'm very attached to where I live and my family and my friends here. So any travel any permanent relocation would feel like a dislocation. But I would like to spend more time there. I kind of feel like there are other folks that have this kind of duality in them. Like there are many people, like for instance, my fiance is from Puerto Rico.
Okay.
So Puerto Rico is despite the confusion of a lot of people, it's part of the United States, and they're American citizens, but it's separate from the United States, and it's a plane ride away, and it's not an easy trip in terms of you can't get there for a weekend.
That's true.
Because of expense and distance, but yet she's very much in both places at the same time. Her heart is very much always in Puerto Rico, and her desire to be there is always great, but she lives here, and you try to manage those things. So Kenya's even farther afield, so if I ever had the opportunity to spend a great deal of time there, it would be a hard thing to manage. But I do want to eventually spend some more time there.
Okay. Actually, we were talking about South Africa, we talked about Kenya, and now you added a little bit of Puerto Rico. So that means you are even broader than what I thought. All right, so you mentioned that you lived in South Africa for 2 good years. All right, what were the culture shock in South Africa? I know we talked about Kenya and the underdeveloped area that it is, but South Africa is very developed. But there you have people from different racial backgrounds that are living there. And I hear about the tensions and everything that is going on there. So when you were in South Africa, I mean, what was the cultural differences that you experienced?
Well, the first thing, and to bring up Latinx culture again, it was, I grew up basically, my family, Nyack, were like, 19 miles outside of New York City. So most of my adult life I was in New York and very close to New York. So you really do have a mixture here. You do, at certain times in the day, you can see black, white, Latino, and Asian people and culture. South Africa there was no Latin culture. None. There's some Portuguese, culture from Mozambique and Angola, but even that is distilled. So that was the first thing I noticed, like just for 2 years not hearing any, Latino music or seeing any, or having any Latino food was unusual for me. But the other thing that I noticed in those 2 years, it was a period of tumult. It was the end of apartheid.
Okay, so by then Nelson Mandela was still alive?
He was president.
Okay.
So the years that I was there, he was the president. So he had a very open and progressive attitude about the continent, particularly because from his point of view, South Africa would have never been free without the sacrifices that were made in North Africa, West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa. All those communities took a hit to support him, because anytime if you were opposed to the apartheid country, they would send mercenaries to kill you. I mean, it was a bloody war for decades.
Yeah, very unfortunate.
So when he became president, the reaction of a lot of Africans was to go there, to be a part of that revolution, to see his presidency, and also to benefit from the economy, because of European and colonialist policies, much of Africa has been starved. And certainly there are hubs, like I know that Nigeria has had a resilient economy for centuries, and other parts of Africa have managed to survive and sustain their populations, but other parts have had an extremely difficult time with civil wars and famine.
That's true.
So there are always a lot of internal refugees,
which is still going on now. Very unfortunate.
So there were a lot of internal refugees. There were a lot of Nigerians, and especially in Johannesburg, there was a lot of people from Malawi and people from Zambia, and all the kind of neighboring countries would come in. And there was xenophobia when I was there. Now I've understood that lately it's taken on a more lethal aspect,
dangerous tone.
Yeah,
that's true.
And but there was certainly a need for people to find work and come for work, and then there were also some people who were talking about building walls and excluding people from other countries, and wanting to know where were you from, almost wanting to see passports, which was ironic because in South Africa, internally, if you were a person of color, you had to travel with a pass book all the time. You had to prove that you had a legitimate purpose that the government recognized to be in one part of the country, and then once that was thrown off, there were some people who wanted to revisit it, but for people from other parts of the continent. But I think that you always have to look at things, like you said earlier, in context. You can't arrive at conclusions without research and without careful observation. And people who are desperate for food and for a meal will treat a stranger differently than a person with a full belly.
Exactly. I like what you just pointed out, because, I tell people most of the time when you hear about the violence that is going on, it's rooted in poverty, because poverty brings the worst out of every human being.
Desperation.
Exactly. All right. So going back to you, Bill, as an individual. All right. So when you identify yourself, do you identify yourself more of a white person or more of a black person when you travel around?
Well, I think that everyone has a right to self-identify.
Exactly.
So I'm black.
Okay.
I've always been black, I'll always be black. I can't control how other people observe me.
Okay. All right. So, this show is about bridging gap. So now that you're in the middle of the two races, what advice would you give people in terms of how to bridge the gap between the racial differences that we have? How do you manage to find yourself comfortable in strange areas? Let's say when you travel to Kenya, when you travel to South Africa, or even when you go to Puerto Rico to visit your fiance's family. How do you really, incorporate other races in what you're doing so that you can be welcomed and as well accept them for who they are? How do you do that?
Well, I think that, historically, if you kind of distill all, religions and kind of codes of conduct, it's very simple. It's kind of courtesy and kind of like the code of the Good Samaritan. You always, if you have a visitor, you treat them with great respect, and if you are a guest, you treat your host with great respect. And I think that a lot of cultures deal with this with people who don't have a lot. One thing you do have is your dignity.
Exactly.
And you have your humanity. So if you model your behavior by the golden rule, if you treat people the way that you want to be treated, I think it really does go a long way. If I, I'm helping raise, my nephew Jamie, and, wherever you go, if you are polite and courteous and thoughtful, and if you listen and are attentive, I think that is a great beginning.
That's true.
And people will receive you and reciprocate. And that's sometimes difficult, and it's not the profile of the ugly American. I mean, we're often, I think, perceived as being very brash and wanting to dictate terms when we go somewhere else, and wanting
I call it stereotype.
Exactly.
Yes.
Well, but I think it's I think it's part of how we've been. I mean, if we want people to understand us, America is a very materialistic driven place where we don't have an opportunity. We're always so busy. I mean, we work harder than not harder, but we work more than most every other place in the world, where other places kind of slow down and have a break and have a 1-month holiday.
That's true. That's true.
We're constantly going, so we don't really have a chance to enjoy people's company, and we're very much new world. But I think a lot of the old world codes of conduct would help us get along better.
Exactly. Thank you so much, because actually I like things that you pointed out in terms of, I like when people use the word we, but this is what I add a little bit to the we's. It's almost like when I said stereotype, because you can't generalize. When you travel, you could see in Kenya, you might still find people that, behave certain ways, and then you can find others that behave in a different way. So when we look at people, I tell people, based on this show that I call Diversity, we should look at every individual for who they are, not what they look like, because every person is different. And when you go to different cultures, like I said, you'll find people that are very, the law-abiding. You will also find people that are not law-abiding everywhere. But if we appreciate each other, like you said, and then treat people how you would like to be treated, I think we can get along better.
Well, let me clarify one thing. I did stereotype Americans, and I'm an American, so maybe I'm allowed to do that. But I'll tell you what. I'll just quote Dr. King. You're not supposed to judge a person by the color of their skin. You're supposed to judge them by the content of their character.
That's true.
Well, we said earlier that poverty sometimes drives behavior. There's a certain poverty in America. There's a certain crisis in our character. Mm-hmm. And I think it manifests itself in the way that we engage the rest of the world. So I have learned a lot about travel, and I've learned a lot from the world, and I think America needs to learn a lot from the world, because right now it's a very, very dangerous world. And right now it's a point in time where we all need to just, honor and respect diversity. So I think your show is extraordinary. It's well timed, and I feel very honored to be a guest. Thank you for having me. Thank you
so much. And as we're rounding up, because actually now you brought me into a different area, because you said it's good to look at the timeline, to go back a little bit. And I see a book that is sitting at the table. It's one of the books that you have written.
Thank you.
And it looks to me, because it has a lot of sketches that look historic. And bringing it, closer to diversity, it's always good to look at the history, because what I have understood is that a lot of people do not read. So when you don't understand history, you don't know where people have gone wrong many years ago. And I look at it like the older generation, even with slavery, with Holocaust, with things that have happened, those happened in the past. And we are the younger generation, and we shouldn't continue to carry the animosity as we travel the journey of life. So it brings me to this book, which is like a historic book that talks about Nyack Village. So this is a very, very old village. And that's why I chose to do this show in Nyack, because I call it a mosaic city. You have people from different races. So tell me a little bit about the book that you've written, about the history of a Hudson River village.
Yeah, so there are 2 volumes. Every Tuesday for the last 8 years, I've published a sketch and an essay. Okay. So at first it was a memoir, so I tell family history. But I also write about people and places of interest. Authors and artists have the privilege of dwelling on subjects that are close to their heart. So I write a lot about art. Edward Hopper, a very important American painter, he grew up here. Carson McCullers is an important American writer. She worked here for many years. Sam Wayman, a very gifted local artist who is the brother of Nina Simone, he lives here and performs. Those are some of the topics that I share. But I think in the African tradition, it's kind of a way of creating an oral history, because I have an opportunity to talk to people and tell their stories and draw where they've lived. Sometimes I draw portraits of them. It's very important, because you won't know what came before you unless somebody takes the time to tell you.
Thank you, and I like that. And it's repeating history,
exactly,
because it's very important. I'm sorry, it's not that I interrupted you, because if you, like I said, if you don't know your past, you won't be able to, know how to operate in your present. So it's always good to bring it. And I tell people, you don't bring it in a negative way. You tell your children, even if you want to tell the story, you tell them this is what happened in the past, this is what we have learned from it, and this is how we're moving on. Not to hold on to it, even if it is just a very, touchy past, like emotional past. You tell it as history, and then you move on. And another thing that I tell people, why I like this book, because you wrote it based on your experiences at NIAC. It's always good to tell your own story. When you allow other people to tell your story, they tell it based on how they feel and their own perception. So it's always good to tell your own story, and then others will learn from your story. And because I believe that a lot of people do not know people's stories.
No.
And that's why, you see, we're basing a lot of things on ignorance. So when you take your time, write things about yourself, talk to people, and then that's what the show is all about. People will come out, talk about their cultures, tell people what others do not know, because it's not good to hear things from second hand. It's always good to hear it from the horse's mouth. Not that I'm calling you a horse, Mr. Bill. Yes. So thank you so much for coming to the show.
Oh, you're welcome. I appreciate it.
I really am highly honored for you to be here. And where can people purchase your book if they want to buy it?
NIACgift.com is where I sell the book and other items that are inspired by the book. I sell some hats and T-shirts and mugs that have my drawings.
Okay. All right. And final note before we cap the show. So, Mr. Bill, we've talked about races. We've talked about everything. What advice? Your final advice that you will give people in terms of the racial tensions, the shootings that we're hearing, people go into synagogues to shoot, they go to mosque, they go to churches, and they shoot people just because of their differences in religious belief. And then sometimes they kill people based on their skin color, just because you don't like someone. So what are some of the advices that you will give people so that they can all live in peace and harmony?
Well, I think that as you talked about storytelling, I think people are very hurt and feeling threatened by each other. And I worked at the housing authority in New York for a long time, and there was a great deal of poverty and a great deal of pain. And I asked somebody, I said, well, there's some children who are born with nothing, and they're born maybe drug addicted, and you can almost see their future. And this was a guy who'd been in this field for a long time. I said, what can be done? What can be done? And he basically said, one person's intervention can change the direction of a person's life. One person's intervention. And oftentimes we wait for somebody to come and help us when we're in pain, but sometimes the act of helping another person changes both lives. So just be there for somebody. Take one simple step in a direction, and it might not ultimately, be a major solution to a major problem in the world, but just to try to make a difference in one person's life. Everything seems so overwhelming in the world right now. So you don't have to worry about everything. You don't have to worry about every problem. You can't worry about every worry. That will just drive you to distraction. So on any given day, just try to make a difference for one person in your life. And then that will, I think, in return, make a difference for you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Batson. Thank you so much for honoring my invitation of coming here. Thank you so much.
My honor. Thank you. Great show. I can't wait to see the other episodes.
Thank you. All right, so that's our show today. And once again, I thank all the viewers, and look forward to the show that will be coming out next week. And we're going to continue to invite guests from different cultures. So if you're interested in coming to the show, if you're from India, from China, from Africa, every part of the world, from Europe, come out. Let's hear about who you are from your mouth, not what we think you are. You tell us about you and your culture and everything, and then clear some of the stereotypes that others have about your culture. And then we can all understand each other and live in peace and harmony. So thank you so much for watching us. It's always a pleasure to have you.
My name is Bill Batson, and I am the artist in residence here at the Nyack Farmers Market. I've been here for almost 8 years now. So every week I'm out here. I sell my book, or actually my books. This is the second volume of the Nyack Sketchlog. Every week I post a sketch and a short essay about the village of Nyack. I write about people and places of interest, public policy matters that affect us here, and from the book, I've taken some of my favorite drawings and created cards. I've created a mug, and I've created these tote bags. This is a drawing from an 1884 map by a guy named L.R. Burley. And I kind of zoomed in on the waterfront. We are a river village, and sometimes I think we have our back turned to the water, where we would, I think, benefit much from being more involved in the life of the river and the recreation and the transportation that it brings. And this is another image that is very important to me. This is Edward Hopper's wooden-wheeled bicycle. Edward Hopper is a favorite son artist of Nyack, and this bicycle is on display in the Edward Hopper house. Every summer, on weekends, the population of Nyack grows by about 5,000 or 6,000 people who bike up from Nyack, from New York City to Nyack. So I believe that this bike not only celebrates Edward Hopper, but it celebrates bike culture, and it also celebrates the tradition of antiques. Nyack used to be an antique capital, and this bike right here you cannot ride. It is an antique. The wooden wheels are broken, but I think it sums up some of the major currents and themes of Nyack. I just started with a tank top. I've had the short sleeve and long sleeve shirts for a couple of years. I know it's late in the season for a tank top, but I've been told by the fashionista in my family that tank tops are great for layering and they're great year-round. So if you want a shirt that celebrates Nyack and cycling, I have one for you. Reach out to me through my website, and if it's not available on the website, if you send me a direct message or you email me, I'll get you one. So I am a columnist for Nyack News and Views. It's a hyper-local website that's been around for over 10 years. Every Tuesday morning, I post at 5 a.m. a new sketch and short essay. If you want to see my work, some of my drawings of other matters and topics, you can visit billbatsonarts.com, and you can find me on Instagram at Nyack Sketchlog.
It's not just radio, it's Rockland World Radio. RocklandWorldRadio.com.